A compost pile the size of a small car, sitting in a backyard in suburban Ohio. And inside it, nothing. No heat, no breakdown, no transformation whatsoever. Just a soggy, stinking mass of kitchen scraps that has been sitting there since March. The homeowner has been doing everything the internet told him to do. Banana peels, coffee grounds, vegetable trimmings, eggshells. All of it goes in. None of it seems to go anywhere. Then, 1,200 miles away in a small market garden in Vermont, a woman named Clara feeds her pile with the same basic ingredients. 2 weeks later, she has dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling compost. The same scraps, the same season, completely different outcomes. The difference isn't magic. It's not some exotic amendment she bought at a specialty store. It's not even that she has more experience. It's that she understands something most backyard composters have never been taught. Not all organic waste behaves the same once it enters the pile. Some kitchen scraps hit the compost heap like a lit match and disappear in days. Others act like wet cement and suffocate everything around them for months. And a small but important category doesn't just fail to compost. It actively poisons your pile, your garden, and potentially the health of anyone eating from it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly which scraps fall into which category, why the fastest composters work the way they do down to the molecular level. And this is the part most guides skip entirely. You're going to know what never, under any circumstances, goes in your pile. I'll get to that list later in the video, and a few of the items on it are going to surprise you. Things you've probably been tossing in for years without a second thought. Here's the problem. The composting advice most people receive is designed to be simple enough to fit on a pamphlet. Browns and greens. Wet and dry. Keep it moist. Turn it occasionally. That framework isn't wrong. It's just incomplete in ways that cost people months of failed attempts, wasted scraps, and a slow erosion of trust in the whole process. The $40 billion commercial fertilizer industry doesn't particularly benefit from you becoming a skilled composter. Neither does the bagged compost sector, which has grown quietly into a multi-billion-dollar market built largely on the premise that making your own is complicated or unreliable. There's no conspiracy at work, just the ordinary economics of a system that profits from your dependence. And as long as the public instruction on composting stays vague, that dependence stays intact. The real knowledge, the granular, mechanistic understanding of why decomposition happens fast or slow, lives mostly in agricultural science journals, in soil ecology curricula at universities, and in the practical experience of market gardeners and farmers who have been running hot compost systems for decades. It doesn't live in the Pinterest infographic. It doesn't live in most YouTube videos, frankly. And the gap between what's publicly promoted and what actually works has real consequences. Wasted food, wasted time, and yards full of half-decomposed mush that gets tossed before it ever becomes the thing it was supposed to become. There's also a deeper frustration underneath this. One I hear from gardeners constantly. You bought the bin. You followed the instructions. You waited. And nothing happened. Or something happened, but it smelled terrible, or attracted pests, or took so long you'd nearly given up. That failure isn't a personal shortcoming. It's an information gap. And this video is going to close it. The stakes here aren't small either. Healthy soil isn't just a gardening preference. It's the foundation of food security, water retention, carbon sequestration, and the entire web of microbial life that makes land productive. Sir Albert Howard, the British agronomist who wrote The Soil and Health in 1947, and is widely credited as one of the founding voices of the organic farming movement, called the compost heap the foundation of permanent agriculture. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing a biological reality that researchers have spent the last 80 years confirming piece by piece. Modern studies from institutions like the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences have repeatedly shown that well-made compost can reduce synthetic fertilizer requirements by 30 to 50%. improve soil water retention by up to 20%, and increase crop yields in degraded soils by a factor that would seem implausible if you hadn't seen the data. What you do in your backyard connects to something much bigger than your tomato plants, which is exactly why learning it properly matters. So let's start at the beginning, not with browns and greens, but with something more fundamental. What actually happens inside a compost pile? The short answer: you are managing a living ecosystem, not a chemical process, not a mechanical one, an ecological one. Inside a functioning compost pile, there are more individual microorganisms in a single handful than there are human beings on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, a class of filamentous bacteria that look like thin white threads and smell wonderfully like fresh forest floor. Protozoa, nematodes, and a rotating cast of larger organisms like pillbugs, mites, and earthworms. Each one plays a different role at a different stage of decomposition. And what you feed the pile determines which organisms get to work, at what speed, and how completely. Microorganisms decomposing organic matter need 4 things: carbon, nitrogen, moisture, and oxygen. Carbon is their energy source. It's like the fuel they burn to run their biological processes. Nitrogen is the building block for their proteins and enzymes, the tools they use to do the burning. Moisture allows all of this chemistry to happen in liquid solution. Oxygen keeps the dominant decomposers, the aerobic bacteria, alive and active. The ratio of carbon to nitrogen is where most composting guides begin and end, the famous C to N ratio. You've probably heard about this. Aim for roughly 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Too much carbon and the pile stalls. The bacteria run out of nitrogen to build enzymes with and simply stop. Too much nitrogen and the pile goes anaerobic, turning slimy and producing the unmistakable smell of ammonia and rot. But the C to N ratio alone doesn't tell you what you actually need to know about kitchen scraps, because 2 materials can have an identical ratio and decompose at completely different speeds based on their physical and chemical structure. That's the piece most guides miss. And understanding it changes everything. Think of a piece of fresh grass clipping versus a piece of dry cardboard. Both have usable carbon and nitrogen. But the grass clipping is soft, thin, high in water content, and full of simple sugars and amino acids that microbes can access almost immediately. The cardboard, by contrast, is dense, dry, and composed primarily of lignin and cellulose, complex carbon polymers that require specialized fungi and actinomycetes to break down first, before bacteria can even begin feeding on them. The speed at which a material decomposes depends on 3 structural factors: its surface area, its lignin content, and its C/N ratio, in roughly that order of importance for determining the first phase of decomposition. Surface area is the most actionable. Smaller particles decompose faster, always. This is not a suggestion. It's a function of how microbial enzymes work. They can only digest material they can physically contact. A whole melon rind might sit unchanged for 6 weeks. That same rind, cut into thumb-sized pieces and buried in the pile, might be unrecognizable within 10 days. Ancient composters understood this intuitively, long before anyone knew what a bacterium was. Chinese farmers of the Han Dynasty, composting organic waste to fertilize paddy fields over 2,000 years ago, are documented as having ground and cut materials into small pieces before incorporation. Not because someone told them the science, because they watched what happened when they didn't, and adjusted accordingly. That empirical wisdom, built over generations of close observation, predates our molecular understanding of decomposition by millennia. And it was correct. Now here's the forward tease I promised you. Later in this video, I'm going to show you the single material most backyard composters have in their kitchen right now that can cut their decomposition time nearly in half when handled correctly. It's not what you think it is. And the reason it works comes down to something happening at the cellular level before you even add it to the pile. Keep watching. But first, let's talk about the kitchen scraps that work fastest and exactly why. At the absolute top of the speed chart are fruit and vegetable scraps, with high water content, and simple molecular structures. Think overripe bananas, melon flesh, cooked squash, tomatoes, cucumber ends. These materials are so close to already broken down that microbes barely have to work. The cell walls are already compromised. The sugars and starches are exposed. The water content, often 70 to 90% by weight, immediately creates the moist environment that aerobic bacteria need to function. In a hot active pile with good oxygen availability, materials like this can be functionally unrecognizable within 5 to 7 days. Not composted fully, but broken down enough that they're feeding the next wave of decomposers. Coffee grounds are another high-speed material, and an underappreciated one. They have a C to N ratio of around 20 to 1, almost ideal without any amendment. They're already finely ground, giving microbes maximum surface area. They're acidic in raw form, which can actually help mobilize certain minerals in the pile. And they carry trace amounts of caffeine and oils that, in the small quantities a household produces, create no real issue for decomposition. The research is clear. Coffee grounds, when used at 5 to 10% of total pile volume, accelerate microbial activity measurably. Beyond that percentage, the acidity can begin to inhibit some bacterial populations. So more is not always better. Grass clippings are another fast mover, with one enormous caveat that I want to address directly, because this is where so many people make a catastrophic mistake. Fresh grass clippings have a C to N ratio of approximately 15 to 25 to 1, perfect for compost. They're soft, moist, and densely packed with nitrogen. In a pile, they break down aggressively and generate significant heat, which is exactly what you want to speed decomposition and kill weed seeds and pathogens. But, and this is critical, grass clippings mat. They form dense, impermeable layers that shed water and block air movement. A pile that's 30% grass clippings, layered in thick mats, will go anaerobic within days. The very material that should supercharge your pile becomes the thing that kills it. The fix is simple. Intersperse grass clippings in thin layers, no more than 2 inches at a time, alternated with drier, bulkier browns. Or, better yet, mix them before adding. The principle here is that nitrogen-rich, high-moisture materials need structure around them to allow air to penetrate. Without that structure, the pile collapses in on itself, and the microbes suffocate. This is actually the same principle used in indoor composting. The hot composting method developed and documented by Sir Albert Howard in the 1920s, during his time at the Institute of Plant Industry in Indore, India. Howard was the first agricultural researcher to systematically document the biological stages of compost decomposition and to prescribe a layering system that managed the C/N ratio while maintaining aeration. His work was largely ignored by the industrial agricultural establishment of the 1930s and 40s, who were pivoting hard toward synthetic nitrogen fertilizers after the Haber-Bosch process made them cheap and abundant. But Howard's research was foundational, and it's been rediscovered repeatedly by every generation of serious soil scientists since. Now, let's talk about the surprising one: eggshells. You probably already compost them, and you're right to. But the reason eggshells belong in the pile isn't what most people think. They don't provide nitrogen. They're not a fast decomposer. In fact, in terms of microbial activity, eggshells are relatively inert. They decompose so slowly that you'll often find them intact in finished compost. What they provide is calcium carbonate. And here's the part that changes how you should think about them. Calcium carbonate is a pH buffer in a pile that's actively breaking down nitrogen-rich materials. The fruit scraps, the coffee grounds, the grass clippings. Microbial activity produces organic acids that can push the pile's pH down into the 4s and 5s, a range where many of the bacteria responsible for further decomposition become inhibited. Adding eggshells progressively buffers that acidity, maintaining the pH in the 6 to 7 range where the broadest range of decomposers can function. They're not speeding decomposition directly. They're preventing the environmental conditions that slow it down. This is a perfect example of what soil scientists call a facilitating mechanism. One material doesn't do the work, but it makes the conditions possible for everything else to do it more effectively. And this distinction matters practically. Don't add all your eggshells at once. Crush them finely and distribute them throughout the pile as you build it. The surface area principle applies here too. A finely crushed eggshell has more contact with the pile matrix than a whole one, and releases its calcium carbonate more consistently. Have you ever actually paid attention to what your pile smells like? Drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious. Because if you're managing it well, it should smell like earth after rain. That petrichor quality, that clean mineral, almost woody smell, is the scent of actinomycetes working. If it smells sour, you have too much nitrogen or too little air. If it smells like nothing, it's probably too dry or too cold to be active. If it smells like ammonia, you have a nitrogen overload. If it smells like rotten eggs, hydrogen sulfide, you have anaerobic conditions developing fast, and you need to act. Here's the mechanism for that hydrogen sulfide production, because understanding it will save you from the most common late-season composting failure. When a pile goes anaerobic, when oxygen gets cut off, a completely different class of bacteria take over. Sulfate-reducing bacteria, instead of using oxygen to break down organic matter, use sulfate ions as their electron acceptor. One byproduct of that process is hydrogen sulfide, which is both the smell and a signal that your pile's biology has shifted into a slower, less productive, more problematic mode. These anaerobic bacteria are not useless. They do decompose material, but they do it at roughly 1/10 the speed of aerobic decomposition, and they produce compounds that can be phytotoxic, plant toxic, if the resulting material is applied to soil before those compounds have fully cleared. The solution? Aerate the pile. Turn it if you're using a traditional system. Add coarse, dry materials to reopen the pore structure. The aerobic bacteria will re-establish dominance within 24 to 48 hours of adequate oxygen becoming available. Now, let's talk about what you should never add. This is the section that most people get wrong in both directions. Either they're too permissive and add things that genuinely compromise their pile, or they've been told a rule without being given the reasoning, and so they follow it mechanically without understanding which version of the rule actually applies to their situation. I'll give you the reasoning, every time. Meat, fish, and dairy. The consensus position in mainstream composting advice is never. The nuanced reality is more interesting. These materials absolutely break down. In fact, they break down fast. They're rich in nitrogen, soft-structured, and highly palatable to microbial communities. The actual problems are practical, not biological. First, in a typical backyard pile that runs cool, meat and dairy become very attractive to rats, mice, crows, raccoons, and other pests before the microbes can fully process them. Second, the anaerobic decomposition of proteins produces some genuinely foul compounds, putrescine, cadaverine, scatol, which your neighbors may not appreciate. Third, improperly composted meat can harbor salmonella, E. coli, and other pathogens that can survive in compost that hasn't reached adequate temperature. The Berkeley method, which runs consistently at 55 to 70 degrees Celsius through intensive aeration and precise CN management, does safely compost meat and fish. Large-scale municipal hot composting systems do it routinely, but in a cold, slow, passively managed backyard pile, keep meat and fish out. Not because it's biologically impossible, but because the risk profile for that specific system is wrong. Diseased plant material. This one is context-dependent in a way that frustrates people looking for a clean rule. The relevant variable is whether your pile runs hot. Many common plant diseases, early blight on tomatoes, powdery mildew, black spot on roses, are caused by fungi and bacteria that are killed at sustained temperatures above 55 Celsius. A well-managed hot compost pile maintained at that temperature for at least 3 consecutive days at the interior destroys most common pathogenic organisms. However, some pathogens are more heat-resistant. Clubroot, which affects brassicas and is caused by the organism Plasmodiophora brassicae, can survive temperatures that would kill most other plant pathogens. It can persist in soil for up to 20 years. If you have had clubroot in your garden and you're not certain your pile reaches and sustains 60 Celsius or above throughout its mass, those brassica roots go in the trash or in municipal green waste, not your compost. Citrus peels. This one has a mythology attached to it that outpaces the evidence. The long-standing advice that citrus should not be composted because the limonene in the peels is toxic to earthworms and the acidity harms microbial communities is based on concentrated doses. In normal kitchen quantities, a few orange peels per week in a pile of meaningful volume. Citrus decomposes without issue. Cutting the peels into small pieces accelerates it, and the acidity is easily buffered by the alkaline materials already present. The rule against citrus in compost is one of those guidelines that was probably appropriate for worm bins, where earthworms are your primary decomposers and limonene concentrations can genuinely build up, and got transferred inaccurately to pile composting, where the mechanism is different. Now the practical blueprint. Here's exactly what I'd tell you if you were standing in my backyard. Start with your pile structure. You need a volume of at least 1 cubic meter, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, to generate and retain the heat needed for rapid decomposition. Smaller than that and the pile loses heat faster than the microbes generate it. You can build a simple 3-sided bin from wooden pallets at no cost. Pallets are free at most garden centers and hardware stores. Or use a commercial tumbler if you're working in a small space. The 3-bin system, 1 building, 1 processing, 1 finished, is ideal for a household that generates consistent kitchen waste, but it's not required to get started. For the base layer, put down 6 to 8 inches of coarse, dry material. Straw, wood chips, or shredded cardboard. This is your air foundation. It keeps the base of the pile off the ground, creates drainage, and allows passive airflow into the pile from below. Your fast materials, fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, fresh grass clippings, go in the center of each layer, not on top. Bury them. This is important for 2 reasons. It prevents pest access, and it puts them in direct contact with the highest microbial activity in the pile. Cover each addition with an equal volume, or slightly more of carbon-rich material. Shredded leaves, torn cardboard, straw. The ratio you're aiming for is roughly 2 to 3 parts browns for every 1 part greens by volume. Don't worry about weighing things. Learn to judge by texture. The pile should feel like a wrung-out sponge when you squeeze a handful. Damp, but not dripping. Most people get the moisture wrong in one specific, predictable way. They add dry materials and assume the moisture from the kitchen scraps will be enough to hydrate the pile. It won't be, especially in summer. Test the pile every few days by squeezing a handful from the interior. If it doesn't hold together and feel damp, add water. If it drips, add dry material. This single feedback loop, touch the pile, adjust accordingly, will solve 90% of composting failures without any other intervention. The second most common mistake is neglecting aeration in the name of simplicity. Turning your pile once a week in warm weather, using a garden fork or a compost aerator, can cut your processing time by 30 to 40%. If you're using a tumbler, spinning it every 2 to 3 days achieves the same result. This isn't just about oxygen supply. Turning redistributes materials so that the outer, cooler edges of the pile cycle through the hot interior. This is what ensures uniform decomposition and reliable pathogen kill. For experienced composters, here's the upgrade. Once your pile is established and running hot, you should be able to feel the heat rising from it when you approach and see steam when you turn it on a cool morning. Begin inoculating each new layer with a thin shovelful of finished compost or good garden soil. You're seeding the new material with an already established microbial community. You're jump-starting the biological process rather than waiting for it to self-assemble. Studies from the University of Vermont Extension Service show that compost inoculation reduces average processing time by up to 30% in cold climate systems. In a Vermont summer, that can mean the difference between finished compost in 6 weeks versus 9. For cold climates, insulate your pile going into winter. A ring of straw bales around the outside of the bin, combined with a heavy cover of dry leaves on top, can extend active biological decomposition by 4 to 6 weeks in late fall and restart it 2 to 3 weeks earlier in spring. Your pile won't fully compost through a hard winter regardless. The biology simply shuts down below about 4 degrees Celsius. But keeping the pile moist and insulated means the microbial community remains viable and explodes back into activity the moment temperatures rise. For hot, dry climates, the challenge runs in the opposite direction. Desert and Mediterranean composters deal with piles that dry out before they fully cook. Shade placement, the north side of a fence or building in the northern hemisphere, reduces evaporation substantially. Covering the pile with a tarp or old burlap sack during the hottest part of the year keeps moisture in without cutting off air exchange. You may also find that your piles run very hot very fast, which is actually an advantage. Just make sure you're adding water consistently enough to keep the microbial community from desiccating. Here's what to look for as things start working. In the first week of a properly built pile, you should see the interior temperature rise. If you've got a compost thermometer, you're aiming for 50 to 65 Celsius in the center. If you don't have a thermometer, stick your hand into the pile about 6 inches deep. If it feels uncomfortably hot, hotter than bath water, it's working. The steam you see when you turn it isn't water vapor from the scraps. It's metabolic heat. The breath, essentially, of billions of organisms processing organic matter at the same time. By week 2, the original material should be becoming unrecognizable. The grass clippings will be gone. The fruit scraps will have vanished. What you'll find is a darker, more uniform mass that smells earthy and slightly sweet. This is where some people get nervous. The pile has shrunk, sometimes dramatically, by 30 to 50% of its original volume. That's not failure. That's success. Decomposition is, by definition, a reduction in mass as carbon is exhaled, as carbon dioxide, and water is driven off as vapor. By month 2 in a warm season pile with regular turning, the finished material will be dark, crumbly, and sweet-smelling. That earthen, fungal quality that signals mature humus. It will have no recognizable fragments of the original materials. It will be populated with fungal mycelium, the white threads you see, which are actually a sign of excellent, advanced decomposition, not mold or disease. And if you look closely, in the lower layers, you'll find earthworms that have migrated in from the soil below, which is the ecosystem voting with its feet. Here's the part that brings everything back to why this matters. When you apply that finished compost to your garden, you're not just adding nutrients. You're adding a living community. Billions of organisms that will integrate into your soil's existing ecology, extend the high-fall networks of beneficial fungi, increase the cation exchange capacity of your soil, meaning its ability to hold and release nutrients to plant roots, and build the aggregated soil structure that allows both water retention and drainage simultaneously. No synthetic fertilizer does all of this. No product in a bag does all of this. This is what soil looked like before monoculture, before tillage, before chemicals stripped it to a mineral substrate. You're rebuilding it. At your kitchen counter, with your banana peels and coffee grounds and vegetable trimmings. There's something profound in that if you let it land. The ancient Chinese farmers, who ground their materials before composting. Albert Howard standing in a field and indoor, watching fungi thread through a pile of crop residue. Clara, in her Vermont garden, lifting dark compost with her hands 2 weeks after building her pile. They're all doing the same thing. They're participating in a cycle that's older than agriculture, older than civilization. They're refusing to treat organic matter as waste. They're treating it as what it actually is, the raw material of life. You now know enough to never have a failed pile again. You know the scraps that move fast and why. You know the ones that need special handling. You know what genuinely shouldn't go in. And more importantly, you know the reasoning behind each rule, which means you can adapt it to your own system, your own climate, your own specific scraps, rather than following guidelines mechanically and hoping for the best. Share this video with someone who's been quietly frustrated by a pile that never seems to work. They're not doing it wrong because they're bad at it. They're doing it wrong because no one gave them the real explanation. The way I see it, every household that masters composting is one less household dependent on bagged amendments, synthetic fertilizers, and the industrial infrastructure built around the premise that your soil is broken and only their products can fix it. That's not a small thing. That's a fundamental act of independence. If this kind of knowledge resonates with you, the real mechanisms, the forgotten wisdom, the practical application that nobody bothered to explain, then subscribe. Because next week, we're going into something I've been researching for months. A soil building technique used for over 8,000 years in one specific region that not only composted organic matter, but permanently altered the structure of the soil itself in ways that are still measurable and still productive today. We're talking about biochar, or more specifically, its ancient predecessor, and the suppressed argument about why it disappeared from Western agriculture. That one's going to change how you think about your soil in a way that's hard to come back from. Everything they forgot to tell you, we'll keep digging it up.